Chapter 21. Every day was a day to get through, a day to wonder about Celia and Granda, a day to long for Da. Anna watched me, shaking her head. She was stronger now, and one morning at last she left her bed and went slowly to the doorway. She looked toward the cliffs. I knew she was looking for Maeve. "It's all I need," she said, nodding at me. "A dog at my hearth, a few weeds for medicine, and a field of growing potatoes." I felt a quick pain in my chest. I knew where Maeve was. I opened my mouth, wondering what to say, but then I saw Sean and his cart coming down the road toward us. Sean was stronger too. I had climbed down the cliff again and again. We had cooked birds, tasting horribly of the sea, eaten their eggs, and Sean had dipped his hands into the bay every day until they began to heal. It wasn't that we weren't hungry. We were hungry all the time. And Patch was still thin, still white, his skirt still big enough for two boys in his size. I went outside to take a breath of the damp air, and there was Sean, coming down the road waving, and his mother lumped up on the edge of the cart, holding a small chest on her lap. "We are leaving," she called, "leaving for Galway to find a ship." Sean? Leaving? Not Sean, too. My fist went to my mouth, hard against my teeth. We had always been together, the two of us. He reached out and took my hand from my mouth. "A friend of Liam's," he said. "Stopped with the papers last night. He told us that Liam and Michael had worked on the docks before they sailed to America." And what of Da and Celia and—" Before I could finish, he shook his head. "There are so many people at the dock." He reached for my other hand. "There is one extra ticket, Nory. Granny's ticket. And it is for you." Smith Street, Brooklyn, horses clopping down the streets, Maggie waiting at the door, food. "Come with me, Nory," he said. Anna spoke from the doorway. "I will keep Patch for you. He will be safe with me." But even as she said it, I shook my head. I would never leave her. It was Patch who had to go to America. Patch who had to have that chance. "Will you—" Sean read, I began, and he knew what I was going to say. Mrs. Mallon knew, too. "How can we take someone so small?" she asked, but Sean held up his hand. We looked at each other, the two of us, and I remembered walking to Patrick's well together. How many times? I had danced with him at Maggie's wedding, making faces at Celia. Dear Celia. I remember singing and sharing dulce with him. I remembered the cliffs. Sean nodded. "You can trust him with me." Don't I know that? I told myself. I couldn't cry now. Not until they were gone. I went to the side of Anna's house. Patch was there, bent over, humming to himself, piling one stone on top of another. I sat down next to him and touched his hair and his little shoulders and his neck that was almost too thin to hold up his head. "Someone's waiting for you," I said. He looked up at me with blue stone eyes. "And who's that, Nory?" I could hardly talk. "It's your own Maggie," I said. "You will climb up on the cart with Mrs. Mallon. You will take your best stones and your coat, and a ship will be waiting for you in Galway." "The Emma Pearl?" he said dreamily. "And you, too, on the cart?" I shook my head. "I must stay here. I will find stones for you and send them some day." He shook his head, beginning to sob, reaching out for me. I held him, his hair fine under my hands, his arms tight around me. He was the last one left. I pried his fingers away. "You must go," I said, my voice hard. "Maggie is waiting, and there will be food." "No!" He pulled at my arm, at my skirt. "Let me stay. Maggie will be waiting at the port of New York for you. She will lift you up, hug you. She will be so happy to see you." He was on the ground now, sobbing, his face buried in the earth. I pulled him up on his knees, looking into that little face. "You will find stones in America. You will build a house and tall buildings." He shook his head hard. I cupped his cheeks in my hands, kissed his tiny nose. "You will remember something when you are an old man like Granda." I said it slowly, each word above the noise of his crying. "You will say that your own Nory sent you because she loved you. You will say that no one ever loved you more." He shut his eyes over his tears, the lids swollen. "Patchine with the blue stone eyes," I said, and stopped. I could not cry. Not yet. I darted into the house, trying to think. An egg hard-boiled for one pocket, another for his hand, a pile of stones, and Anna grabbed up the old black coat to cover him. I went out to the cart, looking at Sean, looking at Mrs. Mallon. "You will put him into Maggie's hands, then?" I said. "It is where we are going, after all," Mrs. Mallon said in her harsh voice, but moving over, making room for him on the edge of the cart. I bent over him and pulled him up, his legs kicking out in his arms. "No, Nory, no!" he cried as Sean took him from me and put him up in the cart. Sean turned back to me. "I will see you on Smith Street," he said. "We will climb cliffs if they are there to be climbed." I reached out and touched his forehead. "Tia sweet." Then I stepped back, and Sean began to pull the cart. "Remember," I called to Sean. "Remember me." I waved to them all the way down the road, and even though I could hardly see for the tears, I could hear Patch crying for me a little longer. Then they were gone. I stood there, my forehead against the wall of Anna's house, feeling its roughness against my skin, sobbing, as Anna rested her hands on my shoulders. At last I turned to her. "Gone," I said. "All of them." She gripped her clay pipe in her mouth. "I don't know why life is so hard," she said. "But I do know this, Nory Ryan. It is a lucky house to have you in it." I wiped my eyes with my sleeve in the back of my hand. "I will walk up to my house. I will see what food there is to find." We both knew there was nothing there, but I couldn't stay there for another minute. I needed time to take deep breaths, time to walk along the road by myself. Later in the day, I'd go down the side of the cliff for eggs again. I didn't need Sean Red. I had gouged out small pieces of rocks, places to fit my feet. I knew where to hold, where to lean, where to rest. I walked to my own house first, added a piece of turf to the fire, ran my hands over the stones in the hearth. I knew the house would be tumbled any day now, but I'd never let the fire go out until then. A trail of stones wandered along the floor. Patch. I caught my breath. I looked out the door the way Anna had, still searching for Dot every day, even though I was sure he'd never come. And then I took the steps over the stile and went through the old cemetery. I stopped for a prayer at St. Ernest's shrine, leaning under the roof to stay out of the wind. I remembered the stones piled up around the statue, Dot fitting each one perfectly together. Remembered his smile as he touched the statue's feet. It'll keep the old monk out of the rain for another 100 years or so. Something was caught against the stone wall. Or was it a piece of wood? I reached for it, and as I pulled it out gently, I could see it was a piece of box. A piece of our box. The box had come all the way from Smith Street. The man must have pried it open and left the part that didn't matter, but it did matter. It made all the difference. I sat back on my heels, holding it against my chest. Maggie had touched it too. I turned it over, patting the rough piece of wood, and it was even more wonderful than I had thought. It had been sheltered from the wind and the rain in back of the shrine, so I could still see what Maggie had drawn. This picture was different from her usual ones, drawn with thin lines of color, greens and yellows instead of thick peat lines. I could see a row of houses stuck together, and in front were people stretched along that Smith Street, and I knew who they were. Dot was there, the tallest, Granda next to him, and Patch on one end looking up. Celia and I were in the middle making faces at each other, and Francie had one arm around Maggie. And Maggie! She had a small curve in her long skirt so that it billowed out, and one hand was over her waist. I ran my fingers over Maggie in her full skirt, so glad the man had stolen the package never knew what he had left best for me. Staying there in Maiden Bay wasn't going to be the worst thing. I would have Anna, and I knew that the small N Maggie had drawn over her skirt, that there was going to be a baby, and she meant to name her Nory. I stood up then and told myself for the 100th time that year that I would never cry again. Then I saw someone was coming. Devlin. And when he saw me, he reined in his horse. "You," he called. "It's you I want to see."